The goal of this video is threefold. The first part, a story of musical gold. An idea persisting since the time of the Greeks that defines the way human creativity speaks. The second, of all the fun games you can play with your newfangled laptop or Gamebox 4K. And the musical multitudes they contain, and the way these worlds interact with your brain. The last of the things I want to share is a brief bit of self-promotion, to be fair, but if Smash is your game, then I ask for reprieve. And I'll show you my own musique generative. Brian Eno is credited with coining the term generative music. He describes it as a system or a set of rules which, once set in motion, will create music for you. There's a beautiful interactive tour of these musical systems made by Tero Parviainen. I want to talk about these systems and provide a bit of context for them in the musical big picture. I am tempted to present these systems chronologically, but I won't. I think there's a better way to talk about this music. Now, you'll have to bear with me here. I think all music is generative music. Of course, we could pedantically dissect Mr. Eno's definition to prove this, but instead of working with a rigid definition, I suggest we put all music on a spectrum. At the left extreme, the author of the music has direct control over every sound in the music. And at the right extreme, the author of the music makes no direct decisions about the sound. So, if the author of the music can offload some number of musical decisions into other systems, can we describe those systems? And what do these systems tell us about the way that humans experience music? Let's dig in. At the non-generative extreme of our spectrum, we have popular electronic music, think EDM. Here, the creator has absolute control over every aspect of sound production, and every time the music is performed, it will sound pretty much the exact same. The introduction of recorded instruments or vocals results in a bit of indeterminacy that could be considered generative. The writer of the music provides instructions for the performers, but the resulting sound is a function of the performer's interpretation and execution of those instructions. And certainly, every time the music is performed, it will sound different. So having a favorite recording of a piece of orchestral music is essentially favoring the conductor and the performers as the appropriate generative system for the composer's musical idea. For a more compelling version of the same argument, take a look at jazz, specifically improvisation. Here, the composer often suggests a series of chords or scales that the performer can use as a launching point, but the resulting sound will vary wildly from performance to performance. This is beginning to satisfy our definition a little more convincingly, but these generative systems basically amount to human interpretation. Terry Riley's In C contains a wonderful example of a generative system that toes the line between human generation and something else generation. This piece consists of a series of melodic fragments that are played sequentially by any number of performers. Every performer has the liberty of deciding when to play each fragment, as well as how many times to play each fragment. No two performances of this piece will sound the same. I say the generative quality of this piece could be considered non-human because, although humans are the ones making decisions, the decisions they're making don't always come off as musically interpretive. Rather, in my experience with the piece, the changes in the sound could be described as random. We can talk about randomness in music later, but for now, let's go back to the Greeks. Their musical ideas are riddled with generativity. Ptolemy suggested that the heavenly bodies and their motions corresponded to musical modes and notes. Now, this is to show that although the term generative music was coined in the 90s to describe music from the past half century, using rules to govern a musical system is not a new trick. A popular game in Western Europe in the 18th century was Musikalisches Würfelspiel. It's a musical dice game. The game contained several short segments of pre-composed music, and these segments were randomly strung together depending on a sequence of dice rolls. Now, if the game was constructed well, the resulting piece of music would sound good no matter how you rolled. So did the makers of these games brute force test every possible combination of musical segments as like a quality assurance before publishing? Maybe. I'm guessing not. The developers of these games had a thorough understanding of popular musical forms, so they were able to abstract out formal rules for smaller sections of a larger form and then pre-compose several segments that satisfied these rules. So the music might not be generative as every piece of the music is composed, but the concept of abstraction is an incredibly powerful one for generative music production. Throughout the 20th century, we have seen an extremely organized academic consideration of generative thought and music composition. The term serial music encompasses many different styles, but in general, these composition systems were developed in an effort to replace tonality. In tonal music, there is a central note that governs the way the music moves. What chords sound good in succession? How should this phrase end? Eventually, composers got bored of the answers that tonality offered and started developing systems that answered these questions in new, surprising ways. There is no time to go over all of these systems, just know that each had rules that governed how a composition was composed. Here we arrive at music that is explicitly given the label generative. I, again, encourage you to click the top link in the description for an interactive tour. It will show you a lot more than I ever could in just a video. You will come to learn that technological developments tend to open doors for generative musicians. Recall that computer music occupies space at the far left of our spectrum. Now, is it odd that it also dominates space at the opposite extreme? Machines with extreme precision, algorithmic composition. Who would want to make decisions? Certainly not me. Random number generators take the place of the creators. Bleeps and bloops and alligators. Now I'm just afraid. And there's data sonification, interactive demonstration, extreme parameterization. Could there still be more? Of course there's more. There's Markov chains, machine learning, TensorFlow. And then there's video game music too. Yeah, what if we used cues in gameplay as parameters controlling a musical process? After all, computers are perfect for generative music. They're good at following rules, repeating processes, generating random values, all these things that composers had been doing by sheer force of will for hundreds of years. I said earlier that I think all music is generative, but that might be a stretch. I will say for certain, however, that all video games play with generativity. Aside from mapping in-game actions to audio, a nearly universal practice is to have the soundtrack respond to what stage, level, or zone you're in, whether or not you're in combat, how low your health bar is, or any other number of game mechanics. The music that is played depends on how you play the game. Let's look at a few games with truly generative music and see what techniques the game composers are using. Spore, released in 2008, allows the player to guide the evolution of a species in an engaging and creative way. The game is chock full of procedural generation of physical objects, so it seems like the perfect game for a generative music soundtrack. And Mr. Eno himself was the man for the job. For the music, he used pure data and amazing visual programming language with incredible potential for generative composition. The music in Spore is highly reactive and in tune with your specific approach to gameplay, resulting in a unique musical experience for every player. Here, imagine a synthesizer patch with a specific arrangement of cables connecting modules and a number of sliders and knobs set to specific positions that results in a certain color of ambient music. If you let this patch sit still, it will eventually grow stale. But if you turn a knob here and there just a little bit, or send a trigger or two into this and that module, a new color is introduced and the variety of the music is increased. In Spore, the way you play the game essentially turns the knobs and pushes the sliders in a specific way, allowing you and your controller to perform the generative function. Red Dead Redemption, a captivating period piece of a game, engages the player in the journey of John Marston, a Western macho bro eager to save his family from the clutches of a government seeking his talents as a hired gun. The music amplifies the gameplay without being distracting, responding subtly but surely to extended horse rides, tense shootouts, and everything in between. In fact, the music itself is so notably dank, it has its own wiki page separate from the game. That's wild. While all the musical sounds were through composed and recorded, the way these recordings were used in the game is undeniably procedural. Bill Elm and Woody Jackson recorded over 14 hours of music for the game in the same key and at the same tempo. They did this so that any number of sections of music could be layered to achieve various textures. Now, this points to a similar conception of abstraction that the musical dice game developers took advantage of. But while the dice game makers were concerned with a horizontal ordering of musical segments, the Red Dead developers were concerned with a vertical layering of musical segments. The last game I want to talk about, the hot topic in procedurally generated game enthusiast circles, No Man's Sky. While the game itself has gotten meh reviews, its music alone is worth talking about. For a physical universe comprised of over 18 quintillion procedurally generated planets, what they essentially did was tear apart full tracks of music by 65 days of static into tiny little segments, even smaller than the segments used in Red Dead. They tore apart an entire album of music, both vertically and horizontally, into solo instrument samples only seconds long, and mixed and matched these samples into a generative musical wonderworld. While I think the music in No Man's Sky is cool, I would love to see a video game score where the people writing and recording the music were also the ones deciding how to deconstruct it and use its parts within a generative framework. Yeah, this sort of setup can work, but there's kind of a disconnect, isn't there? My point is that the video game is a wild medium for music composition that should be enticing for the generative music composer. I think there is a lot yet to explore in the field, but there are some obvious shortcomings of generative music. Namely, it isn't super marketable. If every player has a unique musical experience, then what's the soundtrack? Also, currently, many truly generative musics fail at establishing large-scale formal ideas, which are essential for rounding out a user experience in-game. I think this is one area that generative music, especially in the machine learning area, will grow in. This basically amounts to asking what quality of music comes next instead of asking what note comes next in a melodic phrase. Currently, machine learning can answer the latter in convincing manner, but I have yet to come across a generative system that can both hold my interest from moment to moment and create a variety of engaging overarching forms. Do I think it's possible? Yes. Do I think I'll find the system soon? Probably. I'm going to try to do it. For now, I'll show you my first effort at generative composition. For this project, I used Super Smash Bros. Melee as the generative motor for the music. While two players face off in combat, game data such as X and Y position of each character, player stock count and percent, and a few other mechanics control sliders, knobs, and buttons in a patch I made in Pure Data. I used a beautiful free synthesis module package called Automatonism made by Johan Eriksson. Let's talk about what makes this system generative. There are 3 individual patches of music that can be playing at any point in the match. The 3 sliders at the bottom right correspond to the volume of these patches. If Falco gets a hit, the volume of his music gets increased. The same goes for Ganondorf. The 3rd slider is the neutral patch. It gets slowly incremented when no one is getting hit, and decremented whenever either player gets hit. Falco's patch is a bubbly, random synth sequencer whose root note leaps by 5th every time he gets a hit. Ganondorf's patch isn't working quite right at the moment, but when it is, it's an overdriven random pattern of drum set samples that gets dirtier and grimier as his combo gets longer. His hits also transpose everything down by minor third, giving us access to a variety of disparate keys when combined with Falco's 5th leaps. There are a handful of other little things going on, like the proximity of the characters increasing the volume of a drone in the neutral patch. The register of Falco's patch corresponds to Ganondorf's Y position. The beauty in a setup like this is that there are countless data points constantly buzzing and whirring around in sometimes predictable, other times chaotic ways, and there are countless ways to interpret these data points musically. I would probably place this music somewhere near the center of our spectrum. It's in a weird gray area like Terry Riley's piece. 2 people are performing the music with GameCube controllers, and the performer's actions have a fairly predictable effect on the sound.
We could choreograph an entire match and try to execute it for a specific musical effect. But if the players are just trying to win the match, the human music performance element goes by the wayside. Instead, the generator for the music is this abstract function of a person's knowledge of how the game works and their ability to execute controller inputs. That is to say that the patch has the potential to sound different if highly skilled players were to play instead of me and John.
I don't think fighting games are a particularly great genre for generative composition, but it was an awesome exercise for me to think about the role of generative music in games. I think pretty soon we'll see an open-ended narrative game experience viscerally amplified by a more refined music system than we've seen so far. Of course, there are countless games out there that use generative music really well, so if you have a favorite, let me know in the comments. Okay.